think so. Am I good?
There you go.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning, Rebecca.
So, we're going to start this morning with a brief exercise. Anybody else having maybe an interesting or intense dream this week? Here or there? At least two of us in our house last night in our cabin, had some intense dreams last night. I'm really enjoying actually this invitation to think about our dreams and connect with our dreams as a way of reconnecting with Scripture. So that will be my topic for today. And I'm going to, anybody who needs something to sketch on or jot notes on, you might have your own thing that you'd like to do that on, but we're just going to do a quick sketching or writing exercise. And I do have some pens as well. Yeah. Oh, my name is Rebecca Esterson. I am on the faculty at the Center for Swedenborgian Studies in Berkeley, California. And I'm here with my family this week, and we're all really just loving being with you here.
Say what the date and which lecture it is.
Oh, August 9th. It's August 9th. And I'm here speaking with you. My title is Dream Reading. How does dream interpretation relate to interpretation of the Word? And I'll explain more about that in a minute, but we're starting with a brief exercise here. So I'm going to pass out a piece of paper if you need a pen. I have a pen.
Thank you.
Yep. You have a pen? Do you need a pen? Here, let me. Maybe, could I have an assistant to help me with this? Thank you. Okay, so your assignment, here's your assignment to get our connective juices flowing. Think of a dream, any dream that you've had. It could be a dream from 20 years ago, it could be a dream from last night. And focus in on one person, place, or thing from that dream. One person, place, or thing from that dream. Don't worry about the whole dream for right now. Just pick one image. It could be a lightning flash, or it could be a mountain, or it could be your dentist. One person, place, or thing. Just one, not two. And either sketch it or describe it in words. It's your choice. You don't have to be an artist. It could be a squiggly line. It could be anything that you put down with your pen and your hand onto the page that represents that image in some way. You could write the word, you could describe it, you could even start to think about the feelings that are associated with that image. But try to stay focused on that image, its qualities, and if you want to go into some interpretation of what that might mean, you can do that. But we'll just take 2 minutes here at the start to focus in on one image. So in my lecture today, I'm going to be showing some images by an artist named Sandra Schumann in a series of hers called Encounters. And Dr. Schumann she lives in Somerville, Massachusetts. She used to come and do workshops with us at the Cambridge Church, the Cambridge Swedenborg Chapel. She does collaging workshops, and she really works with images of the subconscious that bubble up when you start doing collaging work and what it tells you about your inner psyche. She's brilliant, and she has a book called Source Imagery in which she begins with exactly this exercise. Pick an image, draw a little squiggly line, draw something begin to engage with the images of your subconscious as a first step on a longer journey of doing this kind of work. So I just wanted to introduce her because we will be looking at some of her work.
Everybody, if your pen doesn't work, there's a little plastic cap over the tip. Just scratch it off.
Thank you. There's a little ball of glue there at the top. So the thesis let me start. We've been invoking our spiritual ancestor, George Dole, this morning. And George would always start his lectures this way, or at least as long as I knew him. He would start his lectures this way. What I say today is less significant than what you hear. So I will start that way. I love that. So my thesis for today is that a practice of interpreting the inner images of our mind and spirit is related to the practice of interpreting the images in Scripture, in the Word. I've been recently inspired by a contemporary theologian named Catherine Keller, who uses this word dream reading. I have this word from her, especially in interpreting the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse. That in engaging with the images and symbols of this book, we are doing a kind of dream reading, and that we are invited to tap into the intuition, the perception, and the wisdom of our subconscious in reading this, and in doing so, it becomes even more relevant to our external, even our political, our engaged life in the world. A bold move. So we have in our tradition this beloved concept of correspondences. That Scripture uses these external forms, these symbols, to invoke inner meaning. And that we make a mistake if we just read at a surface level. That the words in Scripture correspond to deeper spiritual meanings. It's a symbolism, but a symbolism that is organic and living and connected to many levels of existence and many levels within us. We tend, though, in the Swedenborgian Church to think that Swedenborg's commentary on the Bible, Arcana Celestia, or Secrets of Heaven, was the beginning of this. That correspondences begin with Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia, that this idea of correspondences begins with this revelatory first offering of Swedenborg to the world in interpreting the Bible this way. But if we look back at Swedenborg's journey prior to Arcana Celestia and prior to his work in the Bible, we see that correspondences are deeply integrated with his earlier work. And I'm going to suggest today that we can learn a lot about this connection between the dream world and Scripture if we go back and trace Swedenborg's own journey prior to his work with Scripture, prior to his work with the Bible. And if we think of correspondences as something that extends beyond just Scripture, just the Word. So I'm going to begin. He did a lot prior to the 1740s, but in the early 1740s, about 8 or 9 years before the beginning of his writing of Arcana Celestia, Swedenborg was working with this idea of correspondences and applying it to the relationship between the soul and the body, and the relationship between the natural world and the spirit, or the spiritual world. So he wasn't really even working with the Bible yet, very much. And I want to begin, if we could get a new slide up. In 1739 and in 1744, he was working on, we have a cheerleader in the back, a couple of works in which he was concerned in particular with the relationship between the soul and the body. And he was using this idea of correspondences to talk about this relationship. So economia regni animalis and regnum animale, or the soul's domain, or as Eleanor would call it, the animate, the domain of the animate. Okay, there are lots of different translations for these titles. But I'm going to throw up a couple of quotes here from these works. Whereas the soul has her residence in a place so sublime and eminent that we cannot ascend to her and attain to the knowledge of her, except by a particular and general investigation of the lower and accessible things of her kingdom. Or whereas she lives withdrawn so far within that she cannot be exposed to view until coverings under which she is hidden are unfolded and removed in order, it hence becomes necessary that we ascend to her by the same steps or degrees and the same ladder by which her nature in the formation of the things of her kingdom descends into her body. So this is an earlier formulation of Swedenborg's on how we think about the soul. We can't hold on to the soul. We can't really find it materially in the body. It's a little bit beyond our scientific instruments. So what can we do? Do we give up? No. We study the other forms. We study the physical body. And in studying the physical body in its particulars, in it, the way various parts are tied together in the systems and processes at the cellular level. Cells were very exciting in the mid-18th century. They were seeing with a microscope for the first time at the cellular level. Swedenborg's suggesting, actually, don't worry about finding the soul. We can study the body. And in studying the body, we will understand the soul because they correspond to each other. They share a similar form and function. So we can study the body. Next slide. A few years later, the body is her image, resemblance, type. She is the model, the idea, the head that is the soul of the body. Thus, she is represented in the body as in a mirror. So again, he's developing this idea of correspondences through the relationship between the soul and the body. Here she is a mirror. Your image and your body do not touch, right? They are not contiguous in a mirror, but they reflect each other perfectly. They correspond to one another. You can understand the form of your body by looking in a mirror, even if it's not touching your body. So the soul has a similar correspondential relationship. Next slide. In 1741, he wrote this very interesting, or began to write this very interesting study on hieroglyphic key. He picked 21 examples in the natural world. And like light was one of them, light and darkness. And put through a natural and a spiritual and a celestial level of those things. So light corresponds to wisdom, light, intelligence, wisdom, natural, spiritual, celestial level. And for each of these 21 examples, he worked out the natural, the spiritual, and the celestial corresponding elements of these things. It's not until the very, very end of this book that he suggests applying it to Scripture. It is good to interpret the Holy Scripture on these principles, for the Spirit speaks spiritually as well as naturally. Sorry, the quote before it. The spiritual world is the region of antitypes or exemplars. The animal kingdom is the sphere of images and types. Nature is the realm of shadows or resemblances. So maybe in a way similar to his cousin Carl Linnaeus, he is working out categories and types, but not just in the physical world, not just among biological species, but between the natural and the spiritual with these 21 examples. So at the very end here of this book, he is foreshadowing the work that would then occupy him for the next 10 years and would define his work in many ways for generations to come by applying this principle of correspondences to the Word, to the Bible. Before we go there, though, there's something else Swedenborg was doing. He was, yes, investigating the natural, the external world, the physiology of the body, but he was also going inwards to his own subconscious. And during, from the years 1743 to 1744, he was keeping a detailed dream diary. This was a tumultuous year. We might say this was his big midlife crisis this year. This was a year of illness for him, both mental and physical. It was a year of upheaval, spiritual tribulation, and divine calling. This was a big year for him spiritually. It was the year that he began to experience these vivid dreams that he could not ignore, and having waking visions of Christ and angels and all kinds of spiritual beings. And we know that he was writing this in his spiritual diary. He was also keeping a dream diary. Followers and readers of Swedenborg did not know about this for a good 100 years. It was found in the mid-19th century. And it was controversial at first. Readers of Swedenborg were very uncomfortable with this dream diary. And if you read the literature on this, the suggestion is that it's because there's some sexual content in his dreams. He's just putting it all out there. He's not censoring what he's dreaming about. I think there's something else that Swedenborgians were a little uncomfortable with. I don't think it was just the content of the dreams. Because as we'll see in a moment, he's interpreting his dreams exactly, almost exactly the way he then goes on to interpret Scripture. And that might have been a little uncomfortable in the 19th century. The suggestion that the spiritual sense of the word didn't maybe drop out of heaven the way people imagined, but that this was a process, a practice, a spiritual practice of Swedenborg's that he had been developing in other realms before applying it to the Bible. So I'm interested in that controversy. So let's read a couple examples. I just have a few short examples from his dream diary. There's a copy of it here in the library in the Woofenden House if anybody's interested in reading more of it. But let's have a new slide. So here's one example. So he's first telling you a little in his diary, telling himself, a line about his dream, and then he's immediately interpreting it. I asked for a cure against my illness, and I was offered a heap of rags to buy. I took half of them and selected from the other half. But finally, I gave back all the rags. He said that he would himself buy me something that would lead to a cure. The rags were my corporeal thoughts, by which I wished to cure myself, but they were good for nothing. Next slide. Another example. I heard a bear growling, but did not see him. I dared not remain in the upper floor, for there was a carcass that he might scent. I shut the windows. This signifies temptation, as well as avarice, perhaps also other things, and that I am engrossed in my anatomical speculations. And next slide. I saw an absolutely gorgeous woman by a window where a child was placing roses. She took me by the hand and led me. I believe this signifies what I am writing and my suffering, which should guide me. So there are a lot of women in his dream diary, and in his interpretations, they always correspond to an aspect of himself. It's very interesting. It's very kind of contemporary, what he's doing. Everything in here is part of himself. And the women he's attracted to are his own desire for intellectual fame, for accomplishing something in the scientific community and being recognized for it, or pride in his own intelligence. These women that he's attracted to and drawn in his dreams are his own attractions that he is confused by and wrestling with at this period. He's discerning whether to pursue his anatomical research his scientific career, or he has this other higher calling that is there, and he's deciding between two. In some dreams, there's two women, and he can't pick which one to go to. Very interesting. So this comparison, which was maybe a little upsetting in the 19th century when this diary was discovered, this comparison between Swedenborg's interpretation of his dreams and his later interpretation of Scripture raises a question. And we notice he's using similar language. The diary is written in Swedish, by the way, and his commentaries are all in Latin. So when we compare the language, there's that complication. But he's using the language of signifier and signified, which is the language he then uses later. So here's a question it raises, and this is a question that we frequently spend a whole week on in classes I teach at the seminary. Are correspondences fixed or fluid? What do I mean by that? This question comes up over and over and over again in my classes. Are these symbols, are these connections universal? Are they the same for everybody? Or are they individual? Now, when we're talking about dreams and we're talking about Scripture, we might have a different answer. In Swedenborg's commentaries on the Bible, he makes it sound very much universal. This is a universal system of symbols that can be applied across the board, and that we can all access them, and water always signifies truth, birds signify ideas, right? We've been talking about some of these this week. It's much easier when we're doing dream interpretation to say, this is just you, right? This is your own way of creating symbols and narratives and stories from your own life, and it's very particular. So it's your own little world, maybe. But it gets, this question comes up, and I want to just spend a minute thinking about it. Are the meaning of correspondences universal, the same for everybody? Or are they particular to each individual? Philosophers and psychologists have addressed this in different ways, and it's very interesting how different people have come to this same question. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur distinguishes between symbols, which he calls rooted, organically rooted. Symbols are rooted in nature, and therefore the same for everybody. And metaphor, which uses conventions, personal conventions or societal conventions. So symbol has roots. He uses the example of the stormy sea. If we ever encounter a stormy sea in a work of poetry or literature, we know what the artist intended to mean. That's more or less a universal symbol, a stormy sea. Carl Jung distinguishes between archetypes, which are universal. We all participate in the same archetypes, or archetypal forms, which are unique to individuals. Jung famously suggests that archetypes, these universal symbols, are the bridge between the consciousness and the unus mundus, or the underlying unified reality that we're all tapped into. Sandra Schumann, whose art we've been looking at, she distinguishes between two kinds of images: the cosmic, which are universal. She points to snakes, eggs, spirals as cosmic images, and personal images. And I like this quote from her book, Source Imagery. When viewing a breathtaking seascape, we take in the beauty and vastness of the scene, appreciating the might of the water. We're awed by the sense of its infinite majesty. Even when the surface appears rough, churning wildly in the wind, we never think, gee, the water looks disorganized. It might be crazy or out of control. Similarly, the unconscious mind is not disorganized, nor does it represent a wild and crazy force. The unconscious mind is also a natural force. Like an ocean, it operates according to predictable, pre-ordered laws representing principled energy in action, a cyclical phenomenon, life-giving and life-sustaining in essence. So Swedenborg is interesting against the backdrop of these distinctions that philosophers and psychologists have made. He does seem to indicate a universal symbol set in his correspondences. And the way he writes when he's interpreting scripture, this is what it means. This signifies this, period. Right? So I think that can be frustrating sometimes because it doesn't his symbol sets don't necessarily speak immediately to everyone. But he also suggests that we only interpret scripture successfully when we integrate our life with it. So it can't be this externalized formula that we can kind of write down on a piece of paper and hand to somebody else. It is a process of integrating our life with scripture. And I think I have a slide. Next slide. Oh, let's go to the next one. True Christianity 6, my favorite, in which he writes, "The divine, which is inmostly contained in and is protected by such veils in Scripture, are as adapted to the grasp of angels and people, shines out like light passing through crystalline structures. But the light appears to differ according to the state of mind which a person has acquired from God or from himself. For everyone who has acquired this state of mind from God, the sacred scripture is a mirror in which they see God, everyone in their own fashion. This mirror is composed of the truths which they learn from the word and absorb by living their life in accordance with them. A first conclusion from this is that sacred scripture is the fullness of God." I think it's important to hold on to this idea when we are doing Swedenborgian interpretations of scripture, that scripture is dead until it is refracted into the crystalline structures of our own life, until we illuminate scripture by living into it and integrating our story with the stories there. So I want to show an example of this in the next slide. This is a different artist. This is a Swedenborgian artist, Tova King. And this is an interpretation of the woman clothed with the sun in the book of Revelation. I think the woman clothed with the sun is probably the most artistically interpreted image from the word by Swedenborgians out there. I've been collecting them. There are many, many, many artistic renderings of her, and this is one. So I showed this in my class. Well, first let me just remind us Swedenborg's correspondential meaning. Maybe somebody in this room would like to give us the universal meaning of the woman clothed with the sun. She's the new church. Whatever that means, right? She's the new church. And the son that she is carrying and that is eventually born, right? There's this red dragon that is coming for her child, waiting right there. And as soon as the baby is born, the dragon would like to take it and consume it and eat the baby. And the son, this baby, corresponds to the doctrines of the new church, or the teachings of whatever this woman clothed with the sun, whatever this is that's coming into our world, this new era. The sun is the doctrines. So I showed this in my class. Eleanor was there, so she can verify this story. And a woman in the class who's African American was very drawn to this image, and her first reaction to it was very positive. She'd never seen the woman clothed with the sun depicted with dark skin. She was like, wow, this is really beautiful. And then she had a second reaction to it. And she paused and she said, wait a minute, something else is coming to me. And I'm now seeing this story in a way that I've never seen it before, because I'm seeing it depicted this way. The baby was taken from her. The mother and the child were separated in the story. And she said, I can't see this image and not think of all of the women in the history of our country, all of the women of color who have had their babies forcibly taken from them. And I can't look at this now and not be sad for her that she's about to lose her baby, not to the dragon, but she's going to be separated. Even though she's well cared for and the baby's well cared for, there will be a separation, and that's very traumatizing. And at first I didn't quite know how to respond to that, but I can't read the story the same way now, and I don't know if I ever will. And I'm enjoying actually the implications of her personal engagement with this image, because it's really, I'm beginning to ask a question of what does it mean that the teachings of the new church have been separated from the mother of the new church? What does that mean? Is there a trauma there? Is there something there to be investigated that is maybe traumatic that we can wrestle with? So that's an example of where maybe a claim to a universalized symbol set meets a very individual interpretation and a very individual life path, and something new is born of it. Something new comes about, and a new kind of engagement with the symbol and the story is possible. I recently learned that anybody who's studied Quranic interpretation in Islam is familiar with the words ta'wil and tafsir. There's two kinds of interpretation of the Quran. And people interpret these differently. In different kinds of Muslim communities, they'll interpret these differently. But in some places, this sounds an awful lot like the external and the internal sense that we have in our Swedenborgian tradition, ta'wil and tafsir, the external and the internal meaning of Scripture. And I recently learned that prior to the revelation of the Quran, these words in Arabic were used for dream interpretation. These were ways of interpreting dreams that are then applied to the Quran. So there's a similar trajectory there. I'm very interested in Sage's presentation earlier, in which she rightly pointed out the way that George Dole would write his own life into Scripture by way of teaching a Swedenborgian exegetical method. It was his lectures were autobiographical. His lectures on the Bible were telling his own story. And at the end of his life, I was just sharing with Sage and Ted, he, as many of you know, was occupied with studying this early biblical commentary, the Word of the Old Testament Explained, that was never published. He wrote it before Arcana Celestia. And what George Dole found so fascinating in this commentary, this early rough draft commentary, is that Swedenborg is writing his own life, his own story into it. And he brings in the first person pronouns, and he identifies with the characters in the story and maps his own life trajectory onto the story. At one point, he identifies with the starving Egyptians who are experiencing famine. And he writes that he himself is starving spiritually, and he pleads with God on the page, please hear my cry and save me. And he draws a big black line across the page, and the rest of the page is blank. And George was really, really inspired by this. And I would like to suggest that George's attraction to this aspect of Swedenborg's work at the end of his life, as someone who wrote his own story so regularly into his work, that this is part of our Swedenborgian heritage, that reading the Bible is a way of reading our own life story. And to suggest we try this out, maybe this week, that when we encounter stories from Scripture, we imagine them as our own dream world. Imagine that this story, you woke up in the morning and this was your dream. How might you interpret that dream as though it was your private dream, speaking to your own private life journey? So that's just an invitation to try that out as a method. And I think I'll stop there, and we can continue in the discussion. And at the discussion hour at 11, if people want to share anything about their image, their dream image that came to them. But I'll stop my part there.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. Yes.
1740s were a big time all over the world, like the Great Awakening in America. But I'm thinking about Descartes, who was also looking for the soul, and what he came out with is this graph, this XYZ graph, which made science, which split us up, which started science in a way that now is coming to its conclusion with our coders. But meanwhile, Swedenborg never, I believe Descartes sort of split off from it or whatever he did, but Swedenborg stayed the course.
Someone brought up Descartes, so I feel like I have permission to be a little bit nerdy. So Descartes was kind of the generation before Swedenborg, and his whole thing was that he thought that the soul rested in a part of the brain called the pineal gland. And this is where all of this pineal gland discourse kind of comes down to us. It's a Cartesian idea. And he thought this because he thought that the cerebrum, the gray matter, wasn't actually doing anything. And so he was involved in a branch of science, and this is a word that I think Swedenborgians should be familiar with, yantromechanics. And that's the idea that basically you can define the soul with geometry. And so he looked at the brain and he drew a spiral in the brain, and the center of the spiral in the brain is the pineal gland, which is this tiny little thing. And so he kind of saw that as a door where, you know, the soul could come through. And Swedenborg, a generation later, looks at much more detailed anatomical studies because science had advanced quite a bit. And he says, after looking at how actually the nerve tracts go through the brain, he says that there's something about speech and there's something about the way that we breathe, which is actively informing the way that the folds are forming in our brain. And so Swedenborg says there's something, it's the whole system. It's the whole system. The whole system is developing through all of the sensory inputs that's being put into the system. So this idea of anima, and is anima something outside of the world that pours into the world, or is anima a quality inherent in the whole system? And that's kind of, I think that's a big division that, you know, all of science has proceeded from this argument whether anima is part of the system, which is holistic, or anima is something that comes from somewhere else, and then, you know, just happens to show up at a point and the natural world isn't really involved. And that's a fun argument to have, but I think it's really important, you know, contextualizing where Swedenborg is coming from in his own scientific community is super important for understanding the spiritual significance. And I know a lot of people who would argue against looking at the pre-theological works, but you know, personally, that's what brought me back into the church, was reading the work on the soul, was reading the stuff on the brain, and understanding that, like, you know, no, we are part of the world, and our souls are part of the world too.
I grew up with this narrative that maybe still exists quite a lot in the church very Swedenborgian church is that Swedenborg had two careers. He had a scientific career, and then something happened, God came down, and he had a theological career. And we refer to these as though they were these two distinct periods. And then, so when I first time I started reading the pre-theological works, I was thought it's all theology. It's not pre-theological. He was always doing theology. He was never not theological. So I've rewritten that narrative in my own mind, that there's not the pre-theological and the post-theological or post-revelatory phase, but there's much more of a continuum between his periods in his life. Yes, he grows and changes over time in his connection to the heavens, and the Lord evolves and develops over time, but this was a journey that's started much, much earlier. And we have a lot to learn from his diaries and his writings prior to 1745. Yeah.
Hi, this is Gard. While we're on this subject, I'd like to speak in support of this idea. So I'm just going to echo a couple things and then come back to your talk. But in his pre-theological works, which the summit of which occurred in the late 1739, 1740, 41, as we saw, he was talking about the economy of the animal kingdom, which of course is the realm of the soul within the body. So he was dealing before, as we've heard today, with a search for the soul before his enlightenment. And three major concepts that we use in his theological works had already been developed by 1743 and 4. And it's the concept of correspondence, the discrete degrees, and influx. They basically informed his view of his anatomical studies. So in a way, I'm just kind of echoing that support, and I like to hear us going forward in that. I think there's some future to it. I'd like also to support this very broad and deeply well-developed idea that correspondence, as we do use that in Scripture, is a very usable, user-friendly, and very relevant to our interior lives on a personal level and at an objective level. So I won't go further into that, but maybe an advertisement for those of us who want to sit around at 11 when we ring a bell. We can really go into some very interesting conversations around these ideas. And I'll end with just a kind of, I don't like the word normalize, so I use it reluctantly. But I think, maybe this could come up in the discussion group, I think Swedenborg's idea that the anatomical form of a human body, which we're familiar with and which he saw, acts like a mirror to a realm within the body, which is a mental realm. The body is physical. A mind studying the body is mental. And Swedenborg saw that his image of the human body reflected his mental image of, aha, that's the clothing of the soul I've been looking for. And I believe that is a method of inference. We infer something that we can't see on the basis of something we can. That is the definition of inference. And I use that is a very accessible, normal thought process. We can all do that. So I'll just offer that. I'd be happy to be contradicted, but maybe during the discussion.
Thank you, Gard.
It's getting warm in here, so I might put that air conditioner back on and give us a 15-minute break and bring your thoughts back at 11. Yeah.
I did want to just say one last thing. What I was reminded of in the levels that you're talking about. George gave a great example of their connectedness in a spiral, because he said, okay, I love my wife. I have a celestial love for my wife. I can think about my love for my wife, but if I get a call from the hospital saying she's been put into the ICU, I get up and run. And that's the natural that's connected to the deep spiritual celestial. So it's not like we have these three things that end. We have the celestial forms into the natural and informs our actions.
Nice.
Anyway,
Thank you, George.
okay, thank you,
Here's
George.
Susanna.
Thank you, Rebecca. Discussion group at 11, right here.